On this episode, the worldwide impact of the Denisovans and their hybrid descendants upon the flowering of human civilization.
I mean, obviously, the Denisovans themselves probably left the scene by about, well, officially it's 45,000 years ago, but, new evidence seems to suggest some of them may have hung on until around 15,000 years ago. And that's almost up to the time of the cataclysm. But I think what's more important is to remember that they had hybrid. There were people walking around that were mostly modern human, but with a percentage of Denisovan DNA. Now, in modern day context, that's no more than 5 to 6%, but it could have been as much as 10% in 15, 20, 30,000 years ago. That would have made them even more Denisovan.
This podcast is brought to you by Paranormal Contractors. If you have unwanted paranormal activity in your home or business, this is no time to be dealing with amateurs. You need to bring in the professionals. Paranormal Contractors is a division of crime and trauma scene cleaners. They utilize the latest scientific technology to investigate, authenticate, and remediate your ghost or demon problem. Call them at this new number, 631-552-5835. 631-552-5835. That's 631-552-5835. Email paranormalcontractors@gmail.com and tell them Richard sent you. Check out their YouTube channel, Paranormal Contractors, for things that go bump in the night. Welcome to your Friday. Andrew Collins, the co-discoverer of a massive cave complex beneath the Giza Plateau, is standing by to discuss the Denisovans, hybrid humans, Gobekli Tepe, and the genesis of the giants of ancient America. Just a reminder that I'm hosting Coast to Coast AM this coming Sunday, September the 15th, and I hope you can tune in. You can go to coasttocoastam.com and go to the affiliates page to find a radio station that carries the show near you. Tracing the migrations of the Denisovans and their interbreeding with Neanderthals and early human populations in Europe, Asia, Australia, and the Americas. Andrew Collins and co-author Greg Little explore how the new mental capabilities of the Denisovan Neanderthal and Denisovan human hybrids greatly accelerated the flowering of human civilization over 40,000 years ago. They show how the Denisovans displayed sophisticated advances, including precision machined stone tools and jewelry, tailored clothing, celestially aligned architecture, and horse domestication. How Denisovan hybrids became the elite of the Adena mound building culture. Andrew Collins is a science and history writer and has been investigating the origins of human civilization for over 3 decades. He's a noted explorer and the co-author of Denisovan Origins, along with Greg Little. Andrew Collins, welcome back to Conspiracy Unlimited. How are you?
Richard, yes, I'm fine. Happy to be here and plenty to talk about.
Yes, indeed. How long have you been researching and writing about the Denisovans?
We knew nothing about the Denisovans before the year 2010, really. That's when they came into existence out of nowhere. Prior to this time, we knew that our earliest modern human ancestors had shared the world with the Neanderthals, who occupied mostly Europe, Southwest Asia, and right the way across, actually, and through to Central Asia. However, what we didn't know is that the other half of the Eurasian landmass had been occupied at the same time as Neanderthals by a sister group who we now refer to as the Denisovans. Now, they take their name from a place called the Denisova Cave in southern Siberia within the Altai Mountains, because it was here in 2008 that a small finger bone was discovered. It was assumed to be modern human. It was actually broken in half and sent to 2 different laboratories, one of which was in California, and the other one was the Max Planck Institute of Physical Anthropology in Leipzig in Germany. And both of them ended up playing around with it. And it was only, however, the Max Planck Institute that did the full sequencing of this little finger bone. And what they discovered was that the genome of this individual was so different to modern humans that it had to have come from a completely different human species, one that we'd previously not seen before, and hence the name Denisovans. And the other important thing that came out of this genome sequencing in 2010 and then again in 2012 with a higher rate of sequencing was that many of the genes that had been found within the genome were actually found within us as well, strongly suggesting that we had interbred with the Denisovans as we had passed through their territories before their eventual extinction, probably around 45,000 years ago, although as we might get onto, there is some evidence to suggest that some of them may have hung around until around 15,000 years ago. But I mean, what's more important, and I think we need to get onto, is who were the Denisovans and what were their achievements? And maybe we can go on to that next.
Right, absolutely. So they are our ancestors.
No, the Denisovans are closer to the Neanderthals than they are to us. I mean, certainly as far as their DNA is concerned, but we all shared what is referred to as a common ancestor. They're not exactly sure who that is yet, or which particular type of human species that was. Perhaps around about 700,000 years ago, we split off and did our own thing for a while before we evolved into anatomically modern humans around 300,000 years ago. But those that had split off and went the other way became the Denisovans and the Neanderthals. So we all had a chance to develop our own genome, our own mindset, our own material culture, our own physical appearances that were all probably quite contrasting with each other. And obviously varying degrees of levels of sophistication and what might be referred to as advanced human behavior, leading to the rudiments of technology. I mean, for instance, we know that the Neanderthals were actually quite advanced. I mean, even though that's not been credited to them until recent times. I mean, they created cave art. They created the most beautiful stone tools, jewelry. They wore cloaks of feathers and necklaces of eagle or raptor talons of some description. They used gum to create glue. They obviously used fire. They may well even have developed a system of maritime navigation, because there's evidence that they crossed, for instance, to Crete in the Mediterranean at a time when it was, obviously, as it is today, many, many miles away from the coast, the Greek coast, and various other things. So we know that the Neanderthals were very advanced, but it seems as if the Denisovans were even more advanced. And we know this, for instance, from the discovery of this most beautiful item of jewelry that was found in the Denisova cave sometime in the 2000s, that if you just look online and put Denisovan bracelet, it will come up.
Right. I mean, they would have had to have
bangle.
Yeah, they would have had to have constructed pretty sophisticated tools, almost like a drill, in order to.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, drills are nothing new. I mean, there are many, stone tools that are described as drills, and they're long pointed things, and they would definitely cut through leather, through wood, and clearly stone that's softer than the actual type of stone that's used to create the tool. However, the piece of jewelry that we know as the Denisovan bracelet has a hole pierced through it, and when this was examined under a microscope, the feed rate of that drill was so fast that it was comparable to a modern day drill. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they had electric drills or anything like that. But what it does mean is that they were sophisticated enough to create a turning mechanism that ran fast, that could cut holes almost instantaneously. And that's just one example of their technology. Another is that they used bone needles with holes at the end so that you could thread cords through them that was almost certainly used for the creation of tailored clothing. And this is at least 45 to 50,000 years ago. And on top of this, they had musical instruments, arguably the oldest musical instruments anywhere in the world. And beyond that, they had beautiful stone tools, which we compare with our own tools that we used all the way down to the Neolithic age. You know, places like Gobekli Tepe in southeast Turkey. And it seems as if they developed those tools and gave us this particular technology. It's now believed in the area of northern Mongolia, somewhere just to the south of the huge inland sea that we know as Lake Baikal. And this is very, very, very important, because what it means is that there's every chance that aspects of our technologies actually came from the Denisovans. And I would go even further to suggest that all of the rudiments of technology leading to civilization that we had at the beginning of the so-called Upper Paleolithic age, that begins around 45,000 years ago, were given to us complete, already constructed, already in place by the Denisovans as we encountered them.
They had domesticated horses long before other civilizations as well, hadn't they?
Yeah, you see, the domestication of horses is obviously a very controversial subject. I mean, technically, we didn't get on a horse and ride it until the beginning of the Bronze Age, which was one of the reasons why the Bronze Age peoples, known as the Beaker people, were able to forge a path right the way across Europe, ending in Britain and Spain and France by about 2500 BC. However, there has always been some tentative evidence that Paleolithic peoples had ridden horses. The so-called Solutrean peoples, who I write about extensively in the new book, Denisovan Origins, almost certainly were domesticating and riding horses. But on top of that, the Magdalenian people mostly of France, Spain, they also left behind carved art suggesting horses with bits for their mouth, and also skulls have been found with the teeth of war, suggesting that, you know, a bit that would have been created for riding a horse had been used by that animal or been put in place. But the discovery of horse DNA and horse bones inside the Denisova cave has suggested to some scholars that the Denisovans may have themselves ridden horses. Now, that would be, again, 45 to 50,000 years ago. I mean, that's quite extraordinary. I mean, what happened to this technology, we can only but guess. But the thought that they may have been wearing tailored clothing, had musical instruments, beautiful stone tools, and were wearing incredible jewelry, gives us an insight into a people that were incredibly advanced and may well have had the rudiments of civilization, may well have been building structures, may well have been creating irrigation, bridges and things like that as early as this period. But somehow the knowledge of their achievements has until now been lost. But what's so interesting is that the physiology of the Denisovans, which tends to suggest that they were very large people. Now, how large, we don't know. It could just be 6 foot, 6.5 feet, but there's tentative evidence it could be even larger than that, maybe 7.5 feet. Tends to suggest that they could have been remembered as giants in legend and folklore. And that's so interesting, because in the very areas that we find the bones of Denisovans, which the only confirmed areas, let's point out, is in southern Siberia and also on the Tibetan Plateau, in what is today northwest China. There are legends and stories to do with the existence before the presence of modern humans of giants and ogres that were in some cases very sophisticated, created their own dynasties, created their own buildings and structures, built bridges, irrigation, excuse me, and were present and handed on these technologies to us. I mean, in one account of giants in the Altai region, it talks about the giants being given the knowledge of musical instruments and passing that on to humankind. And that seems to be exactly in keeping with the evidence that we have from the Denisova cave, where arguably one of the earliest pieces of a musical instrument have discovered in the form of a whistle or flute. Now, this definitely tells us that the Denisovans had a knowledge of music, an understanding of music and how to play music.
It's been suggested that they were autistic. How do we know that?
Well, because they had two specific genes which have been linked strongly with the activation of autism in modern human groups. Particularly papers have been written in connection with the Han Chinese, where it's been strongly suggested that autism is linked with the presence of these genes. Now, this is not to suggest that the Denisovans were exactly like we might perceive those on the autistic spectrum, but it does raise the possibility that if autism is a genetic I say disorder, we only perceive it as a disorder. It's a different way of leading one's life, however strange it might look to others, but that they themselves may have had these genes which when activated allowed them to develop in different areas away from modern humans to be creative in a way which we associate with those on what's known as the savant syndrome, to have savant syndrome. In other words, these extra special talents that include anything from music to art to calendar counting to lightning calculations to other creative arts, which can often be high functioning. In other words, people with on the edge of the autistic spectrum can still operate within a normal environment and utilize these talents for commercial purposes or whatever. And obviously there are a great number of these savant-like people. I mean, it's considered that at least 1 out of 10 people on the autistic spectrum have these savant-like qualities. So if we can look at the possibility that the Denisovans themselves had some capacity to be able to develop these savant-like qualities, it could tell us why they advanced much quicker than their rivals, the Neanderthals, who do not seem to have had these same genes. So I think that's really important. We know that the Neanderthals became quite advanced, basically through evolution, I should think, more than anything else. But is it possible that the Denisovans advanced even quicker because they had a completely shifted, a changed mindset, one that was much more right-brained, but also functional than that of the Neanderthals? Now, two of the qualities of a person on the autistic spectrum is that they find it difficult to communicate with others, and that makes them withdraw from social groups and spend more and more time in isolation. This is just a natural process because they find it very difficult, to be in the same environment as so-called normal people. And this is strangely what we find in connection with the Denisovans, because there are genes, as I've already mentioned, that will pass on to modern humans. For instance, on the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalayas, there are indigenous peoples like the Tibetans themselves and the Sherpas who have a specific gene called IPAS1, which allows them to exist and to thrive in environments where there is incredibly little oxygen. So in other words, the way that our body processes what little oxygen there is different, and that enables them to live in such environments. We couldn't do it, for instance. We'd
Right.
get out of breath within a few minutes, and it just wouldn't work for us. But for the people that live there, they have a special gene. Well, it's now known that the Denisovans passed on that gene to us because they had it too. Now, what this means is that the Denisovans must have developed this gene across tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years, in such an environment, which most likely was the Tibetan Plateau itself, where we now know that the Denisovans lived, because we have a jawbone that was found in a cave in the northeastern edge of the Tibetan Plateau that has only recently been identified as Denisovan. It was actually found as early as 1980 by a Tibetan monk inside a cave, and he passed it on to the Lama, the living Buddha of his particular monastery, who thankfully passed it on to a local university, but there it languished in a drawer for many years, until eventually, after the realization of the existence of the Denisovans, it was brought out. It was seen to have extremely large molar teeth, just like the Denisovans of the Denisovan cave. And final examination, through the collagen proteins that were inside it, matched that of the Denisovans from the Denisovan cave, which means that we now have two very different locations for the Denisovans. Another gene that we know that the Denisovans had, or in fact another two, was passed down to the Inuit peoples of Greenland. Certainly that's where it's been found, and presumably the Inuit peoples of Arctic Canada and Alaska as well. And this gene, or these two genes, allows the Inuit to live in extremely cold environments. It allows them to bulk up. It allows them to resist the cold. Now, these two genes were also passed on to modern humans by the Denisovans. So this also tells us that the Denisovans must have lived in extremely cold conditions for tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years. So again, these two things, the fact that they lived in extremely high, remote locations where nobody else would have been, plus extremely cold conditions where nobody else would have been, tells us that these people loved isolation. And that also suggests to us that they were there for a reason, that they probably didn't get on with the other types of human species that existed at this time. Now, who else was around? Well, we know that there were Neanderthals, but we also know that the Denisovans actually interbred with the Neanderthals, because we've actually got a bone of a first generation Denisovan Neanderthal hybrid that was found at the Denisovan cave. So the two obviously got on, certainly at times.
Right. Right. So now you have the highly evolved brain of the Neanderthal with an even more evolved Denisovan. I mean, their descendants must have been wonderkins.
Well, exactly. And if you start adding in the fact that we would almost certainly have interbred with both of these, the Denisovans on their own and the Denisovan Neanderthal hybrids, you start realizing you're creating mindsets that are completely new and advanced, because they are adopting all of the elements of those that had gone before. And remember, it's those hybrids that take all of this technology and knowledge forward, not the Denisovans themselves and not the Neanderthals. So they're the ones that we have to thank for all of the developments that are going to take place in the Upper Paleolithic period, which takes us all the way down to 9,600 BC, when, of course, Gobekli Tepe is constructed in southeast Turkey.
More of my conversation with explorer Andrew Collins when Conspiracy Unlimited continues. All right, it's Friday. Let's bring in Christian D. Cadieux, co-host of Reverse Speech Radio. Hey, Christian, we've got another Roger Patterson clip here, right?
Yes, we do. Absolutely.
Roger Patterson, of course, responsible for one of the most famous pieces of film footage ever, I guess next to the Zapruder film, and that, of course, is the 1967 footage of Bigfoot in Bluffs Creek. Let's set this up. What's Roger going to tell us this time?
Okay, so Roger's talking about his experience with Bob Gimlin. Roger states that they were not confrontational in pursuing the creature, and were certainly giving it space. And they didn't want to, of course, in any way, shape, or form, disturb the creature.
All right, let's have a listen. Here we go.
It seemed to give me the impression that it didn't want anything to do with it. It didn't run. No, they didn't.
All right, so there we hear Roger Patterson saying it gave us the impression it didn't want anything to do with us. It didn't run. And then in the reversal, Roger appears to be saying, no one digs in. What does that mean?
No one digs in. My interpretation of this clearly is that no one is digging in to pursuing the creature, neither him or Bob, at the time, and trying to chase it down and provoke it in any way, shape, or form. And also at the same time, no one is digging in to pursue in obtaining footage or documentation on the creature.
All right, so we'll bring you some more Roger Patterson reversals next week. In the meantime, how do people listen to this exciting new podcast, Reverse Speech Radio?
They can listen to Reverse Speech Radio by visiting reversespeech.ca or by going to the Libsyn platform, which is reversespeech.libsyn.com.
And new episodes drop every Thursday. Christian D. Cadieux, co-host of Reverse Speech Radio. We'll talk next week.
Thank you.
If there's one thing money can't buy, it's sanity. Conspiracy Unlimited with Richard Serrett.
Andrew Collins is here, and we're talking about the Denisovans and their impact on civilization. Before we get to Gobekli Tepe, let me ask you about the Denisovans in North America. Did they get there, and if so, when?
Right, well, I mean, firstly, we do know that Denisovan hybrids certainly must have reached the Americas. Now, whether actual Denisovans got there, we'll have to wait and see. We haven't got any specific evidence of that yet, but it seems almost certain that they did. There's no reason why they could not have reached the American continent using the methods that any other modern human achieved at that time, whether that be through coming across the Beringia land bridge at times when it was possible to cross through it, and it wasn't at times when it was drowned beneath the waters, or they could have hopped from coast to coast around the top of the Pacific and reached Alaska that way and the Aleutian Islands and gone further down the west coast of North America. Or, of course, they could have come across directly from either mainland Southeast Asia or island Southeast Asia. There is quite a lot of what's known as Australo-Melanesian DNA within certain tribal peoples in South America, and also within certain skeletal remains been found in North America, which tells us very strongly that there is a good chance of maritime exploration directly across the Pacific at a very early date indeed, arguably 20 to 30,000 years ago, and probably even earlier still.
And
So
are they?
we know that people were making those journeys at a very early date. What's crucially is the fact that we have Denisovan DNA within various Native American tribes. It's not very high, let's point that out, but it's still present, and it's still higher in some than it is in others. The highest is Algonquin-speaking people such as the Ojibwa and Cree, who are mostly in the Great Lakes, St. Lawrence River areas today. But then coming down into South America, there are certain tribes like the Suriname who also carry Australmelanesian DNA in them. They've also got Denisovan DNA, but it's not clear cut because there are some tribes that have Denisovan DNA that don't have Australomelanesian DNA, and vice versa. There's some with this Melanesian DNA but don't have Denisovan DNA. So, we haven't got all the pieces of the jigsaw. But the big other question is whether, if the Denisovans were of large size, whether they can account for the existence in North America and in South America, and almost certainly in Central America as well, of giants, oversized human individuals whose height would have been anything up to 7 to 7.5 feet, maybe just slightly more, but let's stick within that for the moment. And these have been found time and time again within the Native American mound building cultures, most particularly the Adena people, from around 1000 BC down to about the time of Christ. Many hundreds and hundreds. And I mean, these are not just, sensational news reports in the New York Times or something. These are in archaeological journals and books stretching from the mid-19th century down to modern times.
I was in Moundsville, West Virginia earlier this summer.
Yeah.
And the museum there, it's a lovely museum, all of the prehistory of the Ohio Valley. But they sort of address that issue about, where the Adena's giants, and they in the the literature and in their exhibits, they deny that. They say no, they weren't giants. They were average. Yeah. Well,
they're going to, because it just causes controversy. But there are hundreds of reports. And there are certain areas where the incidence or percentage of giant skeletons was so high that it is very clear that this was a very specific human group existing within a more normal-sized human group. And one example, for instance, is what we call the Valley of the Giants, which is the Kanawha Valley of West Virginia. The Kanawha River being, a tributary of or flowing into the Ohio River. And all the way along here, there are Adena mounds that have produced oversized human skeletons. And this cannot be denied. I mean, they were properly documented by the archaeologists working on behalf of the Smithsonian. And these were published in the Smithsonian multi-volume works, the Bureau of Ethnology, bulletins, which were all put together in combined volumes. And these make it very, very clear that you're dealing with a group of humans that existed that are not simply the result of some kind of genetic disorder or abnormality that we might describe today as gigantism. The percentage is far too high. There are percentages that you can consult relating to how many people per thousand that who would likely get gigantism, and it is far less than the amount that have been found in relationship to normal size human skeletons in the mounds within places like the Kanawha Valley. And what's interesting there is that the Kanawha Valley seems to have been centered upon this hilltop fortress on the top of Mount Armstrong in very heavy coal-bearing rock, which obviously has been mostly exploited today. And you have this huge fortress that possibly goes back to the archaic period of Native American history, so maybe as much as 10,000 years, which was surrounded by these cyclopean, huge, great stone walls. And it also had these massive stone towers, all of which I'm afraid have been destroyed, but some of the stone walls are still in place. Myself and my co-author on Denisovan Origins, Greg Little and his wife Laura, were accompanied by some local people from local councils who took us up there and showed us what was going on. And we actually were able to find evidence of some of these walls and photograph them. But the importance of Mount Armstrong, for instance, was a particular type of stone known as Kanawha black flint. It's actually a very hard form of shale, actually, but it was used to create stone tools from the pre-Clovis era, from about 14,000 years ago, right the way down to, historical times. And almost all of it was mined from the slopes of Mount Armstrong, which is almost certainly why that fortress was created. And the main reason for the importance of Mount Armstrong is this special flint known as Kanawha black flint, which was used from at least 8,000 BC through to historical times and was exported widely throughout North America and was much prized, and I suspect had some kind of spiritual power, much like obsidian does to many cultures around the world. And it would seem as if Mount Armstrong, also known as Mount Carbon, was like some kind of center point, really, of this entire network, and that the people in charge of it would seem to have been these, I won't say giants. I mean, I think is these oversized individuals who would seem to have been the shamans. Very often, when their bodies are found in mounds, they're centrally placed with normal-sized people, like spokes of a wheel around them. They're often given grave goods that suggest that they're of high status, most likely shamans. And they existed. I mean, as I said, the percentage factor suggests that they are a human group in their own right. They are not simply people suffering or experiencing what you would today refer to as gigantism. So who were they? Now, were they Denisovans? We don't know. I mean, is the honest answer. I mean, obviously, a lot of people have proposed this, and I suggested it as far back as 2014 in my contribution for the book Path of Souls, which was put together by my colleague Greg Little. I mean, I built every piece of evidence to suggest that the Denisovans were of large size, and if that's the case, then if they did reach the Americas, then the chances are the so-called American giants were their descendants. And I stick by that. I mean, I'm not saying, therefore, every time that we possibly find a giant bone, it's going to be Denisovan. I don't necessarily think that, but I do think that patterns will emerge to suggest that their genetics is linked with that of the Denisovans.
Well, let's
certainly
look.
Hybrid Denisovans.
What about another pattern, and that is cosmology? Is there a pattern or a commonality between the cosmology of the Denisovans and, let's say, the early inhabitants of North America?
Yes, yeah. I mean, obviously, if the Denisovans died out, many tens of thousands of years ago, then we would have to start looking for some kind of commonality between the cosmological ideas that would have been present, for instance, in the Eurasian continent, which is where they were, and those of North America, which we must see as having existed in isolation, at least since the sinking of the Beringia land bridge around 8,500, 9,000 BC. And that's indeed what we do find. It would seem as if there was a universal idea of a death journey that involved certain geological fixed points in the sky. Not geological, what am I talking about? Geographical points in the sky, which would have to be navigated and reached in order to reach the afterlife. And this journey goes roughly as follows. After death, a person who's either deceased, i.e., they've left this world, they've passed on, or, importantly, the spirit of a shaman who would be seen to go into a death-like trance would take a leap of faith towards the horizon where the stars of either Orion or those of the Pleiades would be seen in the early morning just before sunrise. And they would take this leap of faith. They would then join that particular constellation, which would greet them, if you like, almost like a living entity. And then they would be carried or allowed to journey along the Milky Way, which links these constellations. And they would journey along this. They would probably encounter certain obstacles or individuals or something along it until they reached a point where the Milky Way forks into two separate branches, seen in terms of generally logs. And these logs, which were like log bridges, one of which would take you into the afterlife, but the other one, if you were not worthy, would take you to oblivion. Or in some cases, you would be allowed to reincarnate. And the location where this bridge or fork in the Milky Way is located corresponds with the stars of the constellation of Cygnus, the celestial bird. And the reason why Cygnus is a celestial bird is because that bird corresponds with whatever soul bird was seen to be connected with the particular region that these stories built up. I mean, for instance, in Europe and Asia, Cygnus is mostly seen as a swan. A swan is an obvious vehicle of the soul passing from this world to the next. In Southwest Asia, it was seen as a vulture. A vulture figures prominently in the carved art of Gobekli Tepe. Gobekli Tepe is orientated towards the brightest star of Cygnus, Deneb. And in North America, the Cygnus constellation is also represented by birds, sometimes a goose, sometimes a swan-like creature, sometimes by a bird called the crane. But still other times it is a giant eagle-like bird known as the thunderbird. And this is where I find it most interesting, the traditions to do with the thunderbird, because the thunderbird is not simply some kind of spiritual bird that exists in the air. It is also a constellation, as we say, but it can also be the term for shamans, bird shamans on the ground, particularly amongst people like the Ojibwa and various other of the Algonquin-speaking people, some of the Plains Indians as well, also had the thunderbird as this supernatural creature that could take on human forms by transforming itself from a bird to a human. And the way that it did this was to shed its feather coat. It's actually called a blanket, a feather blanket, but the term is almost certainly a reference to some kind of paraphernalia that's made out of bird feathers, most likely those associated with a large raptor, most obviously an eagle, but probably also a hawk on occasions. And what's so interesting here is that this thunderbird, identified with Cygnus, corresponds to a creature that the soul of the deceased or the soul of the shaman encounters when he reaches Cygnus, which is this figure known as the brain smasher or the skull crusher, which sounds gruesome, I know, but has incredible symbolic meaning because it's about the release of the soul from the body, because it was considered that the human skull contained the spirit, but there is more than one type of spirit. There's 2 or 3 different spirits in Native American tradition, and one of them would seem to have needed to be released from the skull for it to journey off into the afterlife. And the skull crusher figure or the brain smasher is some kind of distorted memory of the idea that you have to release the soul by quite literally cracking open the skull, almost like it was an egg. And this is a really interesting symbolism that's obviously derived from rituals where the skull, the human skull, is seen as the point of connection between the physical realm and that of the soul of the deceased, quite literally, so that you would keep the skull back after the interment of the rest of the bones so that you could use it for communication with the dead. And we find this in North America, but it's there right the way across Europe as well. And almost certainly it's there at Gobekli Tepe, because here you've got a cult of the skull, which almost certainly revolved around the idea that the soul inhabits the skull even after death.
Let me jump ahead to this point. Is there a connection between the Denisovans and the legends of Atlantis? These highly advanced people.
Well, I mean, here's the interesting thing, because you have to say to yourself, well, I like what this man's saying, but how does this affect me? And the answer is very clear. Up until now, if you don't want to believe what conventional archaeologists say, that everything's a process of gradual evolution from the sort of middle Stone Age through to the new Stone Age, through to Bronze Age to the modern day, and the rise of the first city-states and civilizations. The other alternatives are these. One, that ancient aliens may have given us technologies that allowed us to build things like pyramids and knowledge of the stars, etc., which may or may not have some relevance to what we're talking about. But secondly, that what we see today in civilizations like Egypt and the Maya and the Inca, Indus Valley, other places around the world, is the product of the survivors of a lost civilization, one that is identified in the Atlantic as Atlantis, and one that's identified in the Pacific as Mu or Lemuria, although technically Lemuria is a misnomer because that should be placed in the Indian Ocean, but that's another story. But so the idea there, and this has been promulgated by a number of authors since the mid-19th century, is that these former civilizations that were island continents, on which thrive these huge, human communities, were devastated by cataclysms. Now, Plato, who is the first to write about Atlantis, talks about this island continent being swamped by earthquakes and floods in one terrible day and night. But there are other legends of a similar nature that could be connected with Mu or any other lost continent. And there are legends. There's no question about that. I mean, certainly there's legends of them in the Pacific of a lost continent. It's not called Mu. I can't remember what it's called at the moment. It's gone out of my head. But there is definitely these traditions. So it's there. The idea that there was a cataclysm, whatever caused it. I mean, to be honest, the modern idea is that it's some kind of comet impact, something I've written about extensively in my book.
The Younger Dryas comet event.
The Younger Dryas event, which, to be honest, is probably the correct solution to it all. That took place about 10,800 BC, devastated large parts of the Northern Hemisphere, with the biggest amount of destruction in North America, but would have had a massive impact on human populations all across the Northern Hemisphere, and to some degree probably even in the Southern Hemisphere. This is something that's almost mainstream now. I mean, it's almost something that people like myself and Graham Hancock have forwarded these ideas for many years, and it's almost like we're handing the baton onto our academic scholarly counterparts now. We don't even almost have to talk about it anymore. But the importance about this is that this cataclysm would have destroyed what we call Atlantis or Mu or whatever. And with it would have gone any knowledge and any technologies, high technologies that perhaps had existed prior to this time and may well have been inherited from people like the Denisovans. So, yes, there is that connection. But I do not believe that Atlantis, which I see personally as a memory of the area of a landmass that formerly existed around what's today the Caribbean, the Caribbean, and the Bahamas, as directly related to Denisovans. I mean, yes, it could have been peopled by their hybrids, but I don't think that's a relevant part of the story at this time. What's more important is the fact that we now have a third option. So we've got ancient aliens, we've got Atlantis as two possible sources of the technologies that allowed us to create civilization. Now there's a third. The third is that the rudiments of civilization were handed to us on a plate by those who were here before us. Most obviously the Denisovans, but also to a degree the Neanderthals.
Very quickly, because we're almost out of time here, but less than 1,000, or no, a little more than 1,000 years later, after the Younger Dryas comet event, when you say a lot of this technology and these civilizations were wiped out, we have Gobekli Tepe.
Yeah.
How does that happen within that time frame?
Well, I mean, Gobekli Tepe was constructed immediately after the end of a 1,200-year mini ice age, which is basically known as the Younger Dryas event. It was almost certainly triggered by the aftermath of this comet impact, due to probably a nuclear winter, which was caused by all the dust and debris of the wildfires that went up into the upper atmosphere, plus the sudden release into the oceans of meltwater that changed the temperature of the oceans and triggered this ice age. Right at the tail end of this, Gobekli Tepe is built, and I'm pretty certain that it was built as a response to what had just taken place. That it was almost like whatever types of cult structures that had been built up to this time had obviously not worked. The world had nearly come to an end. We need to build bigger and better. We need easy access to the sky world to deal with the supernatural creatures that were seen as responsible for such cataclysms. Normally, these were either supernatural dogs or wolves or foxes, all of which were seen to be like tricksters that could, upturn the apple cart and cause devastation in the world. I mean, the most obvious trickster in this form, of course, is Fenris or Fenrir, the huge great wolf of Norse mythology, who is one of the things that brings about Ragnarok, the age of fire and ice that destroys the gods. Fenrir is almost certainly a memory of the comet that initiated the Younger Dryas event around 10,800 BC and was first proposed as such by Ignatius Donnelly, the US congressman and author of books like Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, and Ragnarok, the Age of Fire and Ice, back in the 1880s. He was the first that came up with this, and I think he was absolutely correct.
But the continuity, despite this cataclysmic event, I mean, 1,000 years sounds like a long time, but it's not really. So, did some remnants of those who had been handed this knowledge from the Denisovans, did they survive underground, or and when you go back, like, say, 70,000 years ago in the big Toba eruption, I mean, how did they survive?
It's a difficult one. I mean, obviously the Denisovans themselves probably left the scene by about, well, officially it's 45,000 years ago, but new evidence seems to suggest some of them may have hung on until around 15,000 years ago, and that's almost up to the time of the cataclysm. But I think what's more important is to remember that they had hybrids. That there were people walking around that were mostly modern human, but with a percentage of Denisovan DNA. Now, in modern day context, that's no more than 5 to 6%, but it could have been as much as 10% in, 15, 20, 30,000 years ago. That would have made them even more Denisovan in appearance, mindset, and material culture. And it's those that we should be interested in. It's their route, their journey, their migrations that are important to the foundations of civilization. And what I show in Denisovan Origins, which is obviously co-written by my good friend Greg Little, who's handled the American side of it, is that there is a paper trail in the form of a certain type of stone tool that begins in the area of Siberia and Mongolia and is now being touted as the creation of Denisovans, and is then adopted by us and carried by us into different parts of the world, particularly westwards through Western Siberia, across the Ural Mountains, into Europe, down into Southwest Asia, and into places like Gobekli Tepe. I can show that paper trail all the way from Siberia and Mongolia into Gobekli Tepe. So in other words, if you are looking for the builders of Gobekli Tepe, or certainly the ancestors of the builders, you have to look east as far away as Siberia. And I'm certain of that. I'm certain that that's the case.
Well, Andrew, congratulations on, and to your co-author, of course, Gregory Little, Denisovan Origins, Hybrid Humans, Gobekli Tepe, and the Genesis of the Giants of Ancient America, now available to order on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And we should also mention your website, andrewcollins.com, Andrew Collins, COLLINS.com. Thank you so much for this.
It's my pleasure, Richard. Thank you.
Okay, before I dim the lights in my little studio beneath the stairs, I'll be back in a flash to fill you in on what's in store for the next episode of Conspiracy Unlimited. People are starting to finally discover my Strange Planet shop, and they are loving the gear. The Mayan calendar design seems to be very popular right now, and it's beautiful if I do say so myself. Rick Forgas from Atomic Werewolf Studios in Phoenix has done an absolutely amazing job with all of the designs. The Nazca Lines design is also fantastic, but I think my favorite right now is the Time to Redefine Reality t-shirt. But there's so much more than tees. There's mugs and leggings and tote bags and sweatshirts and hoodies and new designs and products arriving every week. You've got to check it out. Just go to strangeplanet.ca and click on the Strange Planet Shop button at the bottom of the page. strangeplanet.ca. It's a strange planet. Grab the gear. Take the journey. Coming up on Monday on Conspiracy Unlimited, UFO researcher and filmmaker Rob Freeman discusses his journey to document UFO contact and experiencers around the world. Until then, I'm Richard Serrett. So long for now.
A new Conspiracy Unlimited with Richard Serrett drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at conspiracyunlimitedpodcast.com. Blow your mind. That is all for now.